Once upon a time, I lost the second half of a video that I recorded, and I'm here to continue that. As salty as I am about it, it's honestly a blessing that I ended up losing 10 minutes of footage because I was able to dive deeper again into fairy tale retellings. And now I'm able to cover more than I ever thought that I would without breaking the 1 hour mark on a video. You should probably go and check out that video now before we dive into this one. And now that you have, let's roll the titles. Where I last left off, I was discussing a similarity between Barbie and Disney. They both took the name of the Rapunzel fairy tale, or the key tropes of it, and they completely rewrote the story. When you compare both stories to the original Rapunzel tale, they are all completely different. It's essentially fairy tale fan fiction where they took the same characters and tropes within them, but then they put a different story surrounding it. Like, you still have the same concepts in there. It's like an alternate universe fan fiction. So why don't they just decide to make these like sequels to the original fairy tales or something? That's actually something we need to cover though. So let's talk about that as our first official point of this video. After Ever After. What happens once happily ever after is reached? The most common example of this is the Sondheim musical Into the Woods, which follows several fairy tale characters: Rapunzel, Little Red Riding Hood, Jack and his Beanstalk, Cinderella. The first half of the musical covers their actual stories, but the second half, which for some reason people walk out of, and I don't know why. They literally say "to be continued" right before the transition into the second act. Why would you walk out after that? There's more story there. Don't you want to get your money's worth? In the second act of the musical, Jack has brought on the wrath of an estranged giant. Cinderella realizes that marrying a prince was not actually something that she wanted to do, and the witch that raised Rapunzel gets estranged and is dealing with the emotional trauma surrounding that. Into the Woods and similar stories to these explore the concepts of happily ever after not actually being possible and the reality of things. There could be more happiness waiting for you after the end of the fairy tale, or you have to fight to keep that happiness in place. An ending of one story does not mean that their lives are over, so what happens next? They can uncover a second happy ending at times. We can uncover a next generation style of story where the daughter of the original princess ends up trying to get their own happily ever after. Or maybe things can finish in an arguably grimmer place. This is very much a curiosity-centric situation for fairy tale retellings, because consequences and mistakes actually happen. And there's a lot of content out there. There's countless Disney princess sequels. There's Hook, starring Robin Williams. There's Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland. Wait, are those last two even fairy tales? It's lumped into a very close kind of retelling actually, so we might as well touch on classic lit retellings. Fairy tale retellings and classic literature retellings go hand in hand, especially with how old that they are. It honestly makes sense that both can get adapted just as much, Shakespeare's works being the obvious one. If you could even call his writing literature, because in Year 13 English, we literally studied one of his plays for written text. Like, why would you study written text for something that's meant to be performed visually, or like on a stage? That should have been our other assignment. Shakespeare is of note due to how often his plays are put into different sorts of time periods or settings to be able to provide some kind of new insight or relate to the audience. But then they're also adapted further into teen rom-coms. 10 Things I Hate About You, She's the Man, and Oh are each respective Shakespeare adaptations in a teen movie setting. They're adaptations of Taming of the Shrew, Twelfth Night, and Othello, respectively. West Side Story, however, has to be his most famous adaptation, in which Romeo and Juliet gets put into mid-20th century New York City and is instead about gang rivalries and race. Oh no, wait, there's definitely one that's more famous, Lion King. Lion King is Hamlet with animals. These kinds of adaptations not only end up being relatable or entertaining pieces, but they are also a way for Shakespeare to be digestible for audiences. As someone who studied Shakespeare in my teens, I can tell you that I needed that so badly. Shakespeare It's not easy to read, and written texts like books or movies, they are far more accessible to get than a play. The stories, messages, and emotions that come from Shakespeare works end up being relatable generations later. But people who wrote classic books have also had their fair share of adaptations. Some of them with the same name, such as Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. That one's close enough. But there's been several other Pride and Prejudices. Jane Austen actually has had her fair share of adapted works, such as Clueless being an adaptation of Emma, and Bridget Jones' Diary, another Pride and Prejudice adaptation. Do the average viewers know that there are adaptations going into these movies and stories? Probably not. I certainly didn't know that when I was watching Bridget Jones's Diary. I just wanted to watch a rom-com. But it comes to show how the experiences from these classic books are still so universal. This is especially with, compared to fairy tale retellings, a lot of these classic pieces that get adapted are grounded in reality. There is, sadly, no dragons or magic. It's just people living their lives. And sometimes these classics can even take on fantasy elements, such as These Violent Delights or Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. But enough of classic lit, let's get back to fairy tales. Stuff with fantasy elements in them because I miss my dragons. Let's uncover the multiverse of fairy tales. We see the multiverse, places where multiple fairy tales come together in the same world or story, a lot nowadays. We see it with the TV show Once Upon a Time, Dimension 20's D&D campaign Never After. We see it in Shrek. We see it in Disney's Descendants. We see it in Ever After High. When all these fairy tale characters live in the same world, we see them impact and influence each other as these characters that are so well known actually get to interact. Sometimes even original characters come in and start to mess about with things. And these multiverse things can happen during, before, or after their happily ever afters. So what is the point of these? Why have they been done so much, and why are they capturing hearts? Well, as I said in my previous video, every retelling has a reason to be retold. Quite often when you're adapting multiple pieces into one story, that means the things that they are saying as a group matter. The fact that they are together and collaborating matters and means something with the message. Shrek would be the most famous and the most well-liked out of all of these. Shrek was made as the anti-fairy tale and an opposition against Disney. It was made with a 3D realistic animation style, with a lot of different mature or gross things happening to combat the whimsy of Disney. The ultimate lesson from the first Shrek movie was that anybody is deserved to be in the spotlight and to have a chance at finding love. Not just the pretty people that we expect. There's a reason that the ogre is the protagonist. We also see these concepts happen in Descendants and Ever After High. The teen children of fairy tale characters are now going to high school together to live out their destiny that their parents have set before them. But of course there are characters who are born from villain backgrounds who want to change those ideas and have their chance at being good and getting a happily ever after too. And one of the more recent ones on this would be Dimension 20's Never After, which follows the protagonists. They are fighting the forces that are corrupting their stories and preventing them from achieving their happily ever afters. But as they try to fix this, they are wondering if their actual happily ever afters and the fates that they have in store are the fates that they actually want to keep. The things that these characters share within these stories are what make the fairy tale multiverse stories worth retelling. It's a direct compare and connect. Touching more on these fairy tale characters, let's go into another kind of retelling. The same story, but a different hero. These are the kinds of stories that are told through a lens of a different character. We are not seeing the story through the protagonist's eyes. We are seeing it through somebody else. A common trend is to see it being retold from the villain, who is just misunderstood. They are not quite as villainous as we thought. They have their own moral justifications, and the people who were deemed good in the original have severely misjudged them, and the villain's actions are repercussions of that misjudgment. The main two examples here would be Maleficent, a retelling from Disney's Sleeping Beauty, and Wicked, a retelling of The Wizard of Oz. Both are from the perspective of the female antagonist of each story, and both of them sort of serve as a semi-prequel as well before we get into the actual events of the original tale. And both of them have a strong woman fighting against governmental powers to be able to bring about a right. The governments that villainize them. It's a very interesting sort of feminist angle, I think you could say, especially considering the way that Elphaba, the Wicked Witch, and Maleficent get humanized is through friendship, kinship, sisterhood, and motherhood. People love these villain retellings as a whole, not just from fairy tales. Not just because these villains are considered to be iconic. They have very complex morals, which are far more human than the princess who is just so good and so pure. It brings a sense of realism to it. I am going to once again bring up Hoodwinked, the Red Riding Hood retelling, because what they do in this movie is similar. What they do in this is that in the form of a police interrogation, each of the four main characters, Red Riding Hood, the Big Bad Wolf, the Huntsman, and Grandma, share their perspectives on a story in terms of a bigger overarching plot. We get to see a lot of weird misconceptions and misjudgments and perspectives on the whole situation as the bigger picture of some kind of crime happening in the background gets to the forefront through the events that happen. We simply enjoy seeing the perspective of these fairy tales, and we love diving into these perspectives because these fairy tales are so beloved that we want to milk as much out of them as possible. Well, part of it could be love, part of it could just be marketability, but why? Why do we make them darker, brighter, unproblematic? Here's an answer, but maybe not the most right answer. It's a search for happiness. The fairy tales that get retold have some sort of good-evil sort of balance in play. Jennifer Donnelly, an author of fairy tale retellings, explains this in an interview with Book Riot. Most of us are not living our lives at the mercy of a wicked stepmother or an evil queen who has ordered her huntsman to cut out our hearts. But we still know what it's like to be the victim of a mean girl or a queen bee, or to be treated badly by some other authority figure. The message that fairy tale gives us, that kindness truly can win, is incredibly powerful and inspiring. It's an interesting theory when many retellings actually subvert this kind of idea. A fairy tale does finish with happily ever after, but this often gets commented on, such as the book Cinderella is Dead, in which it comments on the straight, white, cisgender sorts of ideas of happily ever after. And sometimes, like Into the Woods, it's straight up denied, where they have to face the consequences of their actions to get what they want. Furthermore, there's quite a few fairy tales that don't have happy endings, like the original Little Mermaid. She straight up dies. It has a bittersweet ending in some versions where she has an afterlife as like sea foam or like an air spirit or something. But that's not exactly happily ever after. And then there's a Little Match Girl, a fairy tale about an impoverished girl straight up dying in the winter. But I think a quote that resonates with Donnelly's ideas surrounding these retellings comes from a myth retelling, from the musical Hadestown. It's a sad song, it's a tragedy, but we sing it anyway, to know how it ends and still begin to sing it again, as if it might turn out this time. We're gonna sing it again. Whether it's the ones that were actually in the fairy tales or reworking to something that's more realistic or more current. And even if they do get an unhappy ending in the retelling, we know that there's some alternate version out there where they do. So where are we going with this? What is the next sort of concept now to come out of fairy tale retellings? What is the future? It is hard to tell where these kinds of stories are going next. Disney's over it, Barbie's over it, the bookish world still seems to be into it, but where is it going? Myth and history retellings seem to be the next direction that retellings are going, with authors like Rick Riordan and Shirin J. Zhao writing works that bring myths and history into a different sort of light. The more recent support for authors of color and representation of stories of color has also meant that other countries have been able to bring their tales to life, such as a retelling of Arabian Nights. These retellings serve as a way for us to know about these kinds of cultures, and it creates a sense of cultural pride for these authors, writers, and directors, which is a very beautiful thing. I even once considered doing a fairy tale retelling series myself, but if I do end up revisiting that idea, I think I'd just go with a standalone. It's Red Riding Hood meets The Road and The Last of Us, essentially. It's also doing that villain subversion where the wolf ends up being an ally to Red Riding Hood in this version. But why do I just want to do a standalone instead of a whole series? Personally, I'm sort of tired of the way that the retellings are done in all these very samey ways. We are definitely in the stage of the classic cycle, and we want to get something a bit more fresh out there. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what kind of fresh fairy tale ideas comes out. Whether it's more myths getting retold, or fairy tales from other cultures, or just more unique sort of ways or concepts to be able to explore these kinds of fairy tales. Maybe Cinderella is the main villain and we're following a villain story or something. I'd really like to see more interpretations, because if people can't get enough of them, they're gonna be hungry for more very soon.